The others are legendary demons from the far north that live on the edges of Westeros and strike fear into the hearts of those who believe in them. It may surprise you to learn, though, that the others aren't really that unique in A Song of Ice and Fire world building. There are at least a few other situations that are very other-like that are going on elsewhere in the world. Since we've been talking about the others so much recently on the channel, I figured it was a good idea to go through these other-like monsters that are out there in the world and try to figure out how they fit into this giant puzzle that is all of this world building that George is doing. So today we're going to be going over these other stories of these legendary monsters or demons, and then we're going to be discussing how they can relate back in and teach us things about the others, and explain what I think George is doing with all this world building and where these legendary monsters come from, and why it would be the case that all over the world we're getting all of these different looking legendary monsters. We're also going to be talking about all these different Long Night legends from around the world that seemingly go alongside many of these monsters. And in addition to that, we'll be talking about the legendary figures that go along with the stories as well. Things like the Night King, Azor Ahai, the Last Hero, all that sort of stuff. I think that the place that we end up makes a lot of sense and is really interesting, so let's just get into it. First, let's just briefly go over some of these other examples of legendary monsters or demons that we see in the world building. The first one that I think most people know about is the Five Forts over in Yi, which is basically the Yi version of the Wall. They're these five giant magical forts with huge magical walls that supposedly protect from shrieking monsters that live in the lands beyond. Now, this is actually a bit of an interesting situation, because supposedly there are these shrieking lizard monsters that live in the lands beyond that are described as legendary monsters. So that sounds almost like another version of the others, these legendary monsters that are beyond this wall. But supposedly the Five Forts were originally built to fight against the Lion of Night and his demons. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something in the world building here, but I'm not entirely sure that it's clear that these lizard monsters that we see there today, that are these legendary monsters, are even the same thing that was brought forth as these demons that serve the Lion of Night. Maybe they are, but it would seem a little bit weird for the Lion of Night and his demons to all be shrieking lizards. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but the other option is that basically we've had two different legendary monsters spring up in the same place several thousands of years apart. It's a bit more of just a curiosity, though. Let me know if you think those shrieking lizard monsters are the ones that were brought forth by the Lion of Night, or if they've sprung up later on at a different date for some other reason, which we'll get into later why that may happen. But it doesn't really matter for the sake of this theory, because either way, we have a legendary monster that exists out there in the world that is very clearly not the others. You would never mistake the others for lizard monsters or someone wearing lizard armor, which is another way that these shrieking monsters are described. They're described as lizard monsters, but some people try to write it off as, oh, maybe they're just people wearing scaled armor. Either way, though, it doesn't really matter because you would never describe the others as lizard monsters, so we know there are at least a couple different types of legendary monsters. The others are different from the shrieking monsters, which may or may not be different from what the Lion of Night was doing, so we either have two or three different types of legendary monsters so far. Before we get too much into the Lion of Night, I would also like to talk about another type of legendary monster, the demons over in the Shadowlands by Asshai. These demons really seem like the exact opposite, like ice and fire parallel to the others in my opinion. The fiery magic is all centered around Asshai, and near Asshai there is the Shadowlands, where supposedly these demons and dragons come from. So at times the others are described as demons made of snow and ice and cold, and then over in Asshai where all the fire magic is done, we have these other types of demons which supposedly have black blood and horns. Which again, black blood and horns, not things that you're ever going to mix up with the others, so we know these demons have a different physical appearance, these are a different type of demons at least on some level, but at the same time they are both types of demons. So that makes it really interesting when you get these parallel legends that are coming out about these different types of demons. Supposedly, according to Old Nan, wildling women would lay with the others during the long night. And according to Dothraki and other Eastern legends, Magi would lay with these demons in the Shadowlands to do horrible magics. Also, it feels like worth noting that creatures that we see in this world that seem to be animated by fire magic on some level have this black blood. So basically, it seems like the difference between these two demons could be that one's made with ice magic and one is made with fire magic, which is something that I've talked about quite a bit in my big long video about the others, which in case I haven't mentioned it, I'm assuming you watched before this. In case you haven't, it sort of explains what I think the others actually are, and I go through all of the book evidence basically every time we see the others to try and prove this, so a lot of what I'm talking about here is just a big extension of that. Just in case this is your first time on the channel and you maybe get a little bit lost, there is context we're building on, so you can go check that out if you haven't. One of the main points that I made in those videos, though, is that the others really do seem to be a product of shadow magic, and therefore these demons that come from the shadow really do feel like a direct parallel. I talked about how the others seem like an icy, more permanent version of Melisandre's shadow baby that she casts with Stannis, but if you wanted the more permanent, fiery version, I think it's probably these demons with black blood and horns that are living over in the shadow. Also, something that probably is worth being its own video at some point, the fact that dragons also come from the shadow and they're constantly described as like these black winged shadows, and Drogon's fire is literally black and shadowy. Yeah, it feels like dragons might also be shadow magic in a similar way to the others in ways that I talked about in those videos, but that's a big tangent that we aren't going to get into here. I just want to point out because some people have mentioned it in the comments and things like that. Yeah, I do think that's a pretty reasonable avenue to go down, and I'll talk about it at some point. So just make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. So now back to the comparison between these different types of demons, right? So we have the word demons used to talk about the others, these demons that are over in the shadow by Asshai, as well as whatever was brought forth by the Lion of Night, whether it's those lizard monsters or some other type of demon that we haven't had described for us. In any case, the picture is very clear here from George R. R. Martin. This is a thing that keeps happening. This is not a unique situation in Westeros that's only ever happened once magically. This seems like it's a sort of natural sort of cycle or a natural reaction of the interaction between human nature and shadow magic as it exists in George's world. Basically, because this power exists, you are going to have times where people choose to try and take and use this power, and that power is going to manifest in a similar way in all these different cultures, but it'll always be a little bit different because the details are different and the situation is a little bit different. Or, in other words, this is an in world archetype. This is exactly how archetypes come about in the real world. All of these different cultures interacting with human nature in a similar way because we're all human, and so therefore we have the same human nature and we're dealing with the same outer worldly forces out there in the world. So, yeah, we have similar archetypes that prop up, but they always take their different cultural forms. And that's exactly what's happening with all of these monsters, all of these demons, all of these legendary Night King like figures, whether it's the Night King in Westeros or the Lion of Night over in ET, these are all in world archetypes. Basically, as far as I can tell, what seems to happen is when someone tries to use this shadow magic power in certain ways, whether it's the Children of the Forest at war with the First Men, or some figure like the Night King or the Lion of Night, they tap into shadow magic, they start bringing forth demons, and it would seem that these demons or these monsters take some form that is relevant to the culture or the conflict that they're fighting in. So, in Westeros, these shadows cast using weirwood magic, which seems to be on some level icy magic, well, they're color matched to the weirwoods and they bring icy cold with them. So, you have these icy white shadows that are out living on the edge of Westeros, where the heart trees are the center of this old ways, old gods, seemingly icy magic. And then over in Asshai, where it's the center of fire magic, you have the Shadowlands and these dark shadows with black blood that have traits that are similar to dragons and live in the place where dragons come from. Especially if it turns out that the others are the shadows of the Kings of Winter in a very direct way that we haven't yet had revealed to us, it would make sense that they are these wintry shadows that are there protecting the Kings of Winter. Once you realize that the others are called demons and these things over in these other places are also called demons, it really just makes sense that this is all the same phenomenon happening in an archetypal way to all these different cultures, and therefore manifesting in just slightly different forms. The forms all do seem to fit right along with the culture who's casting the shadows, and potentially whatever's going on with those shrieking lizard monsters over in ET by the Five Forts, that could fit as well because they are sort of dragon like. So if you have a culture that was worshipping dragons that are no longer existing, or if not worshipping them, had been terrorized by dragon lords for a long time, and therefore may have this sort of psychological scar on their culture that is vaguely dragon shaped, well, if that culture were to have its shadow create some legendary monsters, it would make sense that they would look a little bit like dragons or lizard monsters. There are even theories that part of the reason that every culture seems to have dragon stories is because they have leftover memories of the times that we were hunted by like giant birds and snakes and things like that out in the jungle. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if that's actually true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if some sort of cultural memory like this was dictating the sort of appearance of these shadow monsters that are created. Who knows, as I said, what the Lion of Night and his demons looked like? Maybe they were those shrieking monsters all the way back in the day, or maybe they were something else. Again, I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm not an expert on that sort of stuff. But in any case, basically, if what we're saying is that anytime these different cultures start dabbling into this shadow magic, it manifests in these different cultural forms that they expect it to take, even though they're tapping into the same power. Well, that gets pretty interesting when you think about it in context of what Melisandre has told us about glamours, which is another type of shadow magic power that exists in this world. She literally says that glamours are a spell made of shadow and suggestion. So suggestion can seemingly work in combination with shadow magic. I don't know if that's enough to explain the difference in forms between these different demons that are brought forth by different cultures when they sort of dabble in shadow magic, but it seems like as good of an explanation as any to me. If wearing the armor of the Lord of Bones in combination with shadow magic makes people more likely to view Mance as Rattleshirt, well then in that case it makes a lot of sense that cultural suggestion would sort of have an effect on how people view these shadow demons as well. So if you've spent thousands of years being oppressed by dragons and then suddenly they go away, but you have these shadow monsters that you're still terrified of, well, maybe they would look lizard like we see near the Five Forts. Or if you have these dark, shadowy lands near your borders, well, maybe the shadow demons that come from there are going to be dark and shadowy with horns and black blood. And if you're on a continent that's seemingly completely magically subjugated by these icy magic weirwood trees and the people who worship them, well, then maybe it makes sense that you would be haunted by these icy demons on your borders. So that pretty much explains my answer to the first question of this video. Why are there so many other like monsters that seemingly exist in different parts of the world that don't look like the others? But something interesting that you notice as we talk about this is that this really does pretty strongly imply that there are multiple long nights that have happened in the past. This is something that I've talked about in past videos, and it's one of those ideas that when I first thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, that does sort of make sense. And you know how sometimes you get excited by an idea at the beginning, but then when you think about it a little bit more, it doesn't really work as well and it sort of falls apart? Well, this is the opposite. The more that I think about this, the more that it brings things together so well that I kind of think that it's the only way that you can make any sense of the ancient timeline. Let's just think about the three different locations that we've talked about in this video that all have different legendary monsters and different legends associated with them. So we have near the Five Forts in ET, which were supposedly dealing with ancient Great Empire of the Dawn stuff, the Pearl Emperor, the Lion of Night, having his throne and his descendants usurped, so he gets mad and he sends his demons forward to battle and they have to build the Five Forts. So, considering we know that the Five Forts exist, so something pretty crazy must have happened in the ancient past that caused them to be built, well, how are you going to explain that if nothing was actually going on with the Lion of Night and his demons? If you think there was one long night, and it was surrounding the children of the forest and their war with the First Men and turning the trees into warriors and making others over in Westeros, that means that all these other long night stories from all around the world are basically all just made up to talk about what was going on with the weather when the children of the forest and the First Men were at war. I don't think that makes that much sense. It would basically turn all of these long night type of legends, except for one, into stories like the one that happened when I was 5 years old, and it was one of the first times that the power was out for a really long time that I could remember, and I was just really bored after sitting down in the basement for like 5 hours, and I had been arguing with my mom about how I want to go try the light switch, I want to go try the light switch, I think it's gonna work. And she's like, that's not how it works, the power's just out, that's not how it works. And eventually I got up and tried the light switch, and I'm not kidding, within 2 seconds of me flicking the light switch back and forth, the power happened to come back on for the entire neighborhood. So you were never going to convince my 5-year-old brain that I had not just fixed the power with the light switch. Now, I know as an adult that the power had actually been fixed by someone who was working on the power grid somewhere far away, but at the time it really felt like I had actually solved the problem. So if a million people had witnessed me flicking the light switch as the power came back on, and we never actually got the answer to what solved it, you can see how that type of thing would turn into a legend. So maybe that is what's going on with all these other legends around the world if there was only one long night. That's basically what you have to believe is going on, because only one person was actually the power grid worker, and you can decide which one of the legends you think it was. Do you think that it was the last hero meeting with the children of the forest and solving whatever was going on with the others that actually ended the long night? Well, if so, all those other stories, pretty much you could throw them away, it would seem. Or do you believe that it was Azor Ahai stabbing Nisa Nisa, and that's going to come back to be important? Because if so, then it seems like whatever is solving the long night was happening over in Essos, and whatever was going on with the last hero meeting with the children of the forest, turns out that didn't have anything to do with it. Oh, and yeah, the Five Forts and the Pearl Emperor and the Blood Betrayal, whatever all that stuff was, yeah, you can completely throw out all of that stuff if you want to. Or if you want to just fully focus on that and say that the Great Empire of the Dawn stuff was the actual Long Night, well, then you can throw out all of the other stuff that we've spent this whole time talking about. You see how basically it just makes way more sense to me to say this is an archetype, and actually there are little bits and pieces of all these legends that are going to be relevant, because it's a thing that's happened over and over again, and it's gonna happen again in the story. And just to quickly touch on the idea that, oh, well, maybe it was one global long night and they've just remembered the hero differently and the stories differently. Well, maybe, but at the same time, like, then you do have to just throw away the stories completely. They're completely worthless because all of the details are completely different, right? One of the heroes is seeking out the aid of the children of the forest. They're doing something with them, and then that magic is what ends the long night. And there's a pact, and all of a sudden everybody happy. Or you have someone who's over in Essos stabbing his wife in the chest. Those to me are just straight up not the same story. We're not supposed to like somehow mesh all of those together along with also the blood betrayal and that hero with the monkey's tail or whoever sang a song on the Rhine to bring back the day, right? We're not supposed to like say that these are all just the same cultural memory of one dude. That's just, in my opinion, it doesn't work. Also, it's kind of funny that actually, literally, as I'm editing this video, like it's about to go out in a day or two here, and I just looked at my YouTube Studio app and got a comment, someone saying, "Why don't you ever talk about Azor Ahai or Nisa Nisa in your theories?" And good question. Well, I'm talking about them now, so you're going to be really excited about that. But basically, this is kind of why, right? Because, like, when I'm focusing on Westeros, I think that the problem of the Long Night in Westeros was solved by what was happening with the last hero and the Children of the Forest. Potentially, it cropped up again with the Night King and the Night's Queen, and that had to be solved, right? Those are the solutions that have happened in Westeros. I do think there are little bits and pieces of the other Long Night legends from around the world that are going to come back to be relevant, specifically maybe a little bit of stabbing that goes on between Azor Ahai and Nisa Nisa. Yeah, I think that part's going to come back. But overall, I think that Azor Ahai and Nisa Nisa were dealing with the Long Night somewhere else, over in Essos, with a different cause than what's going on with the others. They all do seem to have done something of magical relevance, and I think it makes a lot more sense to make them all their localized long night version of the power grid worker, rather than having them all be me flicking my light switch while only the last hero is the power grid guy. I suppose it is entirely possible that the entire point of the Azor Ahai Nisa Nisa story is George having a bit of a laugh about, oh yeah, and at the time that the last hero happened to solve the problem in Westeros, some guy was stabbing his wife in the chest in Asshai, so they think that's what solved it. I mean, I don't think that's where George is going with it. It could be, but to me it doesn't work as well as just saying, no, there were probably a bunch of different long nights, a bunch of different triggers, a bunch of different heroes who rose up and solved them, and this is a big archetype and a cycle that's playing out over and over again for all these different cultures. I know that it is possible in the real world for really ancient myths to be adopted by different cultures and given their own forms over time. That is a thing that could explain this, but at the same time, we have direct physical evidence of multiple of these different stories. The wall exists, and we've been in the point of view of multiple people who have seen the others, so we know that those stories are based on some reality. The five forts exist over in ET, so something caused those to be built. We can assume those are based on some real story of something that happened. And we know that dragons exist, so the dragons and demons that come from the shadow, those rumors are seemingly probably true. And considering, again, the others are demons of ice that exist, we should expect those fire demons to also probably exist. And so, with all of that, we probably also have no reason to doubt that those shrieking monsters also exist. You can see how just all the evidence is really piling up that there are multiple different physical bits of evidence of multiple of these stories, probably because multiple of these stories are true. At this point, I kind of view trying to force this all into one global long night as looking at this and saying, Okay, so we have two different cultures on different continents that have very different flood myths, but both of which they say that they built a giant boat that helped them survive. And you could say, okay, well, maybe those are descended from the same story, but that gets a little bit different when you find two different giant boats exactly where they said they would be and the exact size that they said they would be. That's what we have with the wall and the five forts. And when you have the literal existence of the monsters in the world building of today, with the shrieking monsters, the demons, and the others, we seemingly have at least three examples of physical evidence of these sort of demons. In other words, we have physical evidence of multiple boats and seemingly multiple floods. It seems to me that the main reason we would even view this as one global long night is just because it's vaguely talked about in that context by a few characters like Melisandre. But I would explain that by just saying, in this world, historical legends are all sort of mixed up. George definitely plays with the fact that the historical record shifts around a little bit. I just think that the way it's shifted is not from going, oh yeah, there was one global event, and all these different cultures have a little memory of it. I think there's a memory of this event that keeps repeating over and over, and some people have conflated them all into one global event. To me, that's just the most logically consistent interpretation of all these details that George has given us. We're going to continue to explore this, but before we go too much further, if we can sort of agree that maybe these things are an archetype that repeats over and over, I think it would be useful to give each of these parts of the archetype a name. So it really seems like you have a shadow monster that are these legendary monsters, the others, the demons, you could count the dragons potentially even in there, right? These monsters that are a product of shadow magic and people trying to take power. And then it seems like you usually also have a Night King type figure who's the one who's trying to take this power, right? You could argue that in the first instance of the others that are appearing when the Green Seers are fighting against the First Men, that the powerful Green Seers who were possibly creating the others, they were the original sort of Night King archetype figure in that Long Night. And then when the Night King himself was trying to bring the others back, he was the Night King type figure. And in either case, right, you had a Shadow Chaser, whether it was the last hero or the Stark in Winterfell at the time of the Night King, who rose up and put that back in its place before it got too bad and destroyed the world. So, if we were going to give these all names, what I would propose is that the legendary monsters are the shadow monsters in this archetype. You have the Night's King type figure named after the Night's King, and then I would name the last hero sort of archetype after Eldritch Shadow Chaser personally, because I think that's what he's doing. He's chasing away the shadow monsters and the shadow of the culture that has grown very dark and overbearing. The Knight's King figure makes the Shadow large and overbearing and powerful because it makes him powerful, and then the Shadow Chaser has to defeat them and chase the Shadow away, is at least seemingly how it plays out. And as I'm going to cover a little bit more in a little bit, I think that all of these different legends, George is having little details that just directly hit the nail on the head with what he's dealing with thematically or whatever. And when you look at all the different names for all these last hero type figures, I think Eldritch Shadow Chaser is the name where George is just directly hitting the nail on the head for us. I think George sort of views this archetype as the Shadow Chaser, and that's why he chose that name. So again, why is this archetype playing out over and over again? Well, it's due to the fact that this shadow magic power exists in this world and could be taken advantage of in these ways that lead to a potential long night and shadow monsters, and due to human nature and how it interacts with power, this archetype is going to play out over and over again. As evidence for the fact that I think George is thinking about this and how this interaction plays out, here's George talking about how he's thinking about this and how this interaction plays out.
Power, the uses of power, the way power does corrupt us, also the way lack of power corrupts us. You know, we all know the saying power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a great deal of truth in that. But also, I find the desire for power can corrupt us. The lust for power, if you will, makes people do things that maybe they shouldn't do.
You can hear in George's own words there how the lack of power can corrupt people just as much as having power can, and that maybe in order to gain that power, those people will do things that they shouldn't do. And he's concerned with that in his story, so he's filled his world building full of many stories where I think people were doing that around the world, and he's told us about the consequences that it had. Now, if the characters in our story today make the same mistakes, we can't be surprised when they end up with a similar result. And it goes a little bit deeper than that once you realize this, because George is actually using all of these different long nights and these different stories to give us little hints about how the long night and the others could play out. As I said in the other video where I was just talking fully about what the others are. George has left them so far off the page that he needs other ways to tell us little foreshadowing and little hints about how they work. So, when you look around the world, all of these different Long Night legends have little bits and pieces that I think are going to be thematically relevant to the Long Night story that George is going to have set up for the end of the books, the one that our characters in the modern day are going to have to deal with. I talked recently about how one of the main reasons I could see for the others having been cast in the first place at this point is to enforce the old ways and potentially even enforce the Stark dynasty. The worship of the Weirwoods, the Starks in Winterfell, all of that could be enforced by the fact that if you stop doing that, the magic of the wall could stop working and the others could come back and kill you. As long as you follow the old ways and worship the Starks, you'll be fine and the wall will hold. Well, if that is indeed the case, then suddenly the story of the Lion of Night has a pretty interesting bit of information in it. The Lion of Night was the founder of this dynasty who called forth his demons once his family was usurped from the throne. And of course, if Bran the Builder is the initial source of some of the others that we see out there north of the Wall, and they come back whenever the Starks are usurped from power, well, that is actually pretty much a direct similarity to what we're told with the Lion of Night now, isn't it? George is again potentially giving us a hint about what could be going on in one of these other stories that directly parallels the others, but isn't actually about them. And he always keeps these stories to these vague little references, which we're probably not going to be able to put together until we have all of the information. But I do think it's also worth noting some of the things that he brings up as happening during the time where the Lion of Night was bringing forth his demons. Specifically, things like enslaving your own people and cannibalism. Supposedly, these were some of the things being done by the Bloodstone Emperor. He enslaved his own people and supposedly also feasted on human flesh. So we have a figure who is feasting on human flesh, enslaving his own people, and suddenly there are these demons that are showing up and attacking everyone. And in Bran's story, what do we have him doing? Well, he's apparently potentially feasting on human flesh with Jojen paste, and he's already feasted on human flesh with cold hands on the way north, and he's being strapped into these magical trees that seem to have enslaved the people of Westeros for thousands of years at this point and forced them into blood sacrifice to the Weirwoods. So, all of that is connected to these demons that are nearby and could attack, potentially if those are not followed anymore. And in addition to this, if you buy the theory that the Weirwoods or the Greenseers are the source of the others, well then the others practice necromancy, so you've got necromancy, cannibalism, and enslavement, all these things that Bran is getting himself wrapped up in. Yeah, it really does seem like all of this stuff is thematically the same sort of thing. Whatever happened in the Bloodstone Emperor's case may not actually be knowable directly because it was so long ago, but the fact that we have enslavement, cannibalism, and demon attacks with these shadow demons, well, that seems like it's all just telling us a lot of the thematic points of Bran's story. And it's not just the Lion of Night and the Blood Betrayal story, he's doing this with all the different legends, right? We talked about how Eldrick Shadowchaser just very directly tells us what these heroes are likely doing, but all those other heroes have little bits and details in there as well. There's a hero with a monkey's tail, which people always talk about how the Starks are like half wolves, so an animal connected hero is out there and solving the problem. There's one story where they sing a song to bring back the day. The children of the forest are those who sing the songs of the earth. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a song that's involved before the end of this. There's also mention in that story from the Royne about how all the children of the Royne had to come together and put aside their bickering, which is one of the things that obviously is going on in Westeros, right? All these lords are bickering and not preparing for what's actually coming for them. So it's all the same thematic points that are being driven home in all these different little stories. Basically, George is using all these little bits of world building to give us little bits of the hints of what's going on with these long night type events. None of them will give us the full picture because he's saving that for the one that plays out in our actual story, but if you do want to piece it together, you're going to have to grab little bits and pieces from all these different legends. Obviously, I've talked about how I think Bran's going to have to reject this cannibalism and enslaving all of his people, so in that case, it really does seem like the Bloodstone Emperor is obviously the bad guy, and maybe he was the one who was the cause of all these demons, the sort of Night King type figure, and he blamed the Lion of Night for it. I don't really know. It's really interesting because, as I said earlier, it's rumored that the Five Forts were built by the Pearl Emperor to keep away the Lion of Night and his demons, but if you look at the history of ET, the Pearl Emperor was way before the Bloodstone Emperor, and supposedly the Lion of Night brought forth the demons when the Bloodstone Emperor committed the blood betrayal, So it looks like we might even have two different sort of events where they were fighting off the Long Night and the demons that came with it because of the Lion of Night. This would parallel how when Old Nan tells the story of the others, she says that's when the others came for the first time. And we have the story of how the children turned the trees into warriors, which seems like they were creating others and bringing them forth in their war with the first men. And then much later than that, we have the story of the Night King with the Night's Queen, who it seems like they were at least starting up, bringing back the others. So it seems like we have multiple different places where we've already had multiple long nights or close call long nights. Even when you focus on just one specific place, you can't narrow it down to one single long night, in my opinion. Both of these locations seem to have a story that's long night like, at least, that takes place after the giant structures were originally built to solve the demon problem in the first place. The Night's King ruled from the wall, so by definition he was after the original incidents with the others and the Long Night, and the five forts were, as I said, originally built way before the Bloodstone Emperor, so if that was when the Lion of Night brought forth his demons, that really can't have been the first or only time. Also, just to frame it in a way that I really think drives home this idea of multiple long nights getting conflated into one, if you were raised Catholic and went to Catholic school like me and George R. R. Martin, you were always told growing up how every culture has a flood myth, therefore you know the global flood of the Bible has to be true, because every culture talks about the big flood. But if you're a skeptical little child, as George R. R. Martin seems to have been, you eventually start to try doing the math on how much water you would need to cover the entire Earth, and you start to realize that maybe it makes a little bit more sense that there were a bunch of really bad localized floods, which we know happened, and then all these different cultures told their stories about the time that their entire world flooded, and then when people later on who believed in a giant global flood heard all of these legends, they said, yeah, clearly these are all part of the same legend. I think it would make complete sense from George R. R. Martin's life experience to put that exact thing going on in his world. And the main person who we're really hearing about the ancient global long night from is, guess who? Melisandre. She's the one who seemingly has all this information about what's going on, and she is a religious fanatic from a religion who believes that this was all one global event that they helped solve. Or at least the hero that they worshipped helped solve. You know what I mean? Like, in either case, right? I think that they have a story from their culture that solved the long night. And so when all these other cultures talk about, oh yeah, we remember a time where the sun disappeared too, and they're like, yeah, clearly these are all the same event. But I think that's how in world these characters have gotten this messed up in a very George R. R. Martin way. It's exactly like what's going on with the flood myth. You basically have a very prominent religion looking around at a bunch of different cultures around the world telling a similar story and pointing at all of them and saying, see, all of these are evidence of the time that our hero saved the world in our story. That feels like something that George R. R. Martin could draw on from his own life experience, and it makes sense with how this is presented in World, at least to me. At the very least, a giant chunk of Essos, or a lot of the characters that we meet from Essos, have adopted the framing of the religion of the Lord of Light in terms of talking about this ancient myth. But all these other local cultures still talk about their own local stories, but at the same time, you have a ton of people looking for Azor Ahai because that's probably the most popular one at this point. Notably, that sort of combining of legends hasn't quite yet reached Westeros as they still talk about the last hero, but as soon as Melisandre shows up in Westeros, what does she start doing? She starts talking about someone who's still clearly going to do the exact thing that the last hero was doing as though they were Azor Ahai. So you can literally see her directly in the story trying to do this conflation to the legends of Westeros. Just straight up walks in and is like, oh, hey, yeah, you guys have this ancient historical history of a last hero who solved this problem. Yeah, no, that's Azor Ahai. You're looking for Azor Ahai reborn, actually. Suddenly, what was at one point two very clearly different stories are now one story in the mind of at least anyone who believes Melisandre. And I'm not even saying she's doing this maliciously or anything like that or trying to like convert them. I think this is just naturally how she reacts, right? She hears a story about how some hero needs to end the long night, and she knows she's looking for Azor Ahai Reborn, so she'll just plow over whatever local legends there are and just be like, nope, guys, we're focused on Azor Ahai here. And I think the popularity of the Lord of Light across Essos has probably just sort of led to this effect, sort of just, as I said, combining all of these legends. Basically, it could just be the case that the Red Priests have had this prophecy about Azor Ahai being reborn that they've been talking about for so long that it's just overshadowed all of these other places where this has happened because no one's talking about the hero with the monkey's tail coming again, or Eldrick Shadow Chaser reborn. But Azor Ahai reborn has good branding, basically. So I'd say that's my take on what's most likely to be going on with all these different long night legends and how they sort of interact with one another. And yeah, as I hope I've made the point here, I really do think there are multiple. We as a fandom, when we're viewing the story through the heads of characters, definitely have it presented to us as though there was one global ancient long night. But again, just I think if you go to base principles, like look at all the evidence like an archaeologist and ignore what all the characters say, it really seems like there has to have been multiple. Another thing that I feel like I should mention, because this is the thing that originally got me thinking that there were probably multiple long nights, is just how similar the creation of the dragons and the creation of the others seems to be. They're both creations of powerful forms of magical life, possibly to maintain the power of the dynasties that created them, and they exist on both sides of ice and fire, so they seem like a parallel to one another. So it really seems like the creation of the others was the thing that was creating the long night in Westeros that the last hero had to deal with. So it would make a lot of sense to me that the long night that Azor Ahai had to deal with was probably due to the fallout of the creation of the dragons. You know, the whole dragging the moon too close to the sun, all of a sudden a bunch of dragons are created. That sounds like some powerful magic to me. Also, the way that the stories are described, the moon moving too close to the sun and drinking in its fire, or the sun hiding its face, well, both of those do sound remarkably similar and sort of like a real world event that can happen. We'll get to that later. So, considering dragons come from the shadow, and let's just assume for the moment that they are in fact shadow magic, well, then the creation of the dragons and the creation of the others are both exactly what I'm talking about with this archetype here. You have someone who is trying to take this incredible shadow power and use it in a way that's probably not natural, and might even break the natural order of the world in a very important magical way. It seems very likely to me that the Weirwood system was used in the creation of the others, and it was almost certainly corrupted in some way when it was used for this dark magic. I've talked about this in the past, as have others. It seems like it's unnatural for these trees to be crying blood and having bloody human hands. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen a tree that has a weird old guy strapped up in the roots who's sustained to eternal life, probably feeding off of the blood that's fed into the trees. This feels like a corrupted magical system. So it seems that the World Tree or the Tree of Life may have been thrown off in the blood magic that was used to create the others. And of course, we also have the story of how the dragons were born, where there used to be two moons in the sky, and one of them was dragged too close to the sun and drank in its fire, and thousands of dragons poured forth. So, whether you're corrupting the world tree or the tree of life, or the celestial bodies that orbit the planet, in either case, you can see how you're definitely throwing off the natural order of things and the balance of the world when someone tries to take this powerful magic. It seems that in the stories, when someone tries to take power in this way for whatever reason, that is the thing that kicks off this long night type cycle and sets the world into a place where they need to be rescued by someone like Eldrick Shadowchaser, the last hero, or Azor Ahai. In my opinion, that's what's most likely being set up here, and you have a very clear setup for these different long nights that are created in a similar but slightly different way, and then they're rescued by their various heroes. So yeah, Azor Ahai was probably fixing whatever happened with the creation of the dragons, the last hero fixing whatever happened with the others, and whatever was going on with the Lion of Night probably did have to do with the blood betrayal and whatever else was going on, whenever the five forts were originally built. Each of these different stories gives us vague hints as to the causes that could lead you into these long nights, the sort of monsters that you might be facing during them, and the sort of solutions that might present themselves. It already seems that we have a last hero situation going on with Bran going north and seeking out the aid of the Children of the Forest the way the last hero did. And of course, we've already talked about how all those different little bits of other stories are playing into Bran's overall themes, and we've already talked about how specific elements, like maybe a song that was sung to bring back the day, or putting aside bickering, or potentially even a stabbing, are going to be important elements in the endgame. So I think hopefully I've made my point about how all of these legends and stuff sort of interconnect, but one thing that I do want to talk about before we end the video is just what would this long night look like if this is sort of a localized phenomenon that can happen over and over again when someone's trying to take control of incredibly powerful shadow magic. Well, as I talked about in my video about the others and how I think they're created, I think there's actually a pretty good amount of evidence to suggest that shadow magic may flow through the moons. And when we look at the story about how the dragons were born, what do we have? We have a story where the moon moved too close to the sun and drank in its fire. And that really sounds to me like the way an ancient myth would describe an eclipse where the moon moves in front of the sun and takes away the light of the sun. So, if we're looking at the creation of dragons as a corruption of nature and the fire side of shadow magic in the same way that the creation of the others was a corruption of the icy side of shadow magic, if the weirwoods and the others are connected to the icy moon, the dragons being directly connected to the fiery moon does make a lot of sense. Another thing that I talked about in the previous videos about this is the fact that when George R. R. Martin did a bunch of the world building for Elden Ring, they had a situation where there were two moons in the sky, but one of them was cloaked by a dark magic. Basically, it drank in the light rather than reflected the light until that magic cloak was lifted off of it. So, when you have one of the moons that is now disappeared in Westeros, maybe a similar thing is going on. Because when you have all this black stone over in Asshai that is somehow magical and also drinks in the light, it really does make sense that maybe if the moon is magically being moved around in the sky and used for shadow magic, that yeah, maybe those are pieces of that moon. And that's why they drink in the light, because that entire moon now drinks in the light. So, roll with me here for a minute. The moon is a powerful magical source. You're dragging it in front of the sun, creating an eclipse, and basically hanging it over your head to do magic with it, and then also potentially altering the fire moon to make it cloaked in some sort of dark magic as well. But basically, the point is hanging it directly over your head if you're going to use it as a source of amplifying your shadow magic to bring about this sort of long night and these legendary shadow monsters. Well, that seems like something you would do. When Tormund talks about the others, he says they don't come out during the day. But when the sun isn't out there to outshine the moon, it seems that's when these potentially moon cast shadows that are the others are able to roam freely. So if you want to bring about a long night, you need to drag that icy moon in front of the sun and have it hide its face for a generation so that the others can walk around and do what they need to do. But that would pretty much be the exact thing you would need to bring the others back in full force if they are indeed cast from the moon. An eclipse where you're magically suspending the moon in the exact place it needs to be to cast a permanent eclipse. Considering George directly gave us the setup about the moon wandering too close to the sun, being moved around the sky sort of to do magic with the creation of the dragons, it really makes sense that yeah, this is something that maybe a very powerful shadow magic user or sort of a Night King type figure could do. They could literally actually affect the orbit of the moon. And so, when we take all the pieces of the evidence that we have, the stories that we have, and try to say, what would a long night look like under this circumstance? Well, it would seem like this Night King type figure would do some powerful magic that would drag the moon overhead. This would lead to the legends like the moon wandering too close to the sun or the sun hiding its face for a generation, and it would allow this moon magic to be cast with its full power permanently, giving us the exact stories we get with the long night. It's also worth noting, I think there's definitely room in here for moon meteors to be included as well, for those of you who are David Lightbringer fans, as I know a good chunk of my audience is, or even for David if you're listening. I think that, yeah, there are a lot of stories where it seems like moon meteors or chunks of this moon are also brought down to Earth. The Bloodstone Emperor is said to worship a black stone that fell to Earth. And of course, we have over in Asshai where it seems like a good chunk of the city is built out of this black stone that seems to drink in the light, which I've speculated could be chunks of that fiery moon that was dragged overhead. So, yeah, in addition to an eclipse, I feel like some moon meteors coming with that would make a lot of sense, because if you have the ability to drag the moon overhead to block out the sun, you seem like you would have the ability to pull down some pieces of the moon as well, and we do have seemingly some solid evidence of that existing out there in the world building. So, yeah, it feels like this manipulation of celestial bodies and dragging the moon around, maybe pulling chunks of it down, that's what I think we should expect the long night to look like. I know that some of you were watching my original video about the others where I got to the part where I started talking about shadow magic flowing through the moons, and it may have sounded crazy at first, but there is just so much stuff about the moons in the world building that seems to line up in these weird ways that it feels like on some level or another the moons are related to these shadow monsters that are created, the dragons or the others, and the long nights or whatever sort of effects follow that creation. Speaking of the effects that follow that creation, we do also have a legend of a moon that is now currently missing, and far over on the opposite side of the world, we have a permanent shadow that seems to exist on the world that is literally called the Shadow by Asshai. So, would anyone really be surprised if maybe whatever remains of that fiery moon that was turned black is on some level or another still hanging where it was over Asshai? That really wouldn't surprise me at all, and actually something that I've been thinking about for quite a while is the state that Asshai remains in to this day, and that's one of the last things I'd like to cover here in this video. The basic idea about Asshai is something that I've been thinking about ever since I saw the Interesting Nerd Club's video called The Seaweed Theory. It's an episode where they talk about an idea sent in by a viewer named Steven, and basically part of the idea is that Asshai is still under some form of the Long Night. This is something that has stuck with me because honestly, it just really makes a lot of sense on a few different levels. They're near something called the shadow, so there's one area of the Earth that is seemingly covered in a permanent sort of shadow. And if you told me that there was one area of Earth that was covered in a weird shadow in real life, I would think, well, maybe there's an eclipse going on there. But it seems like that's permanently going on over in Asshai. In addition to the fact that there seemingly is still some sort of shade like effect hanging over the area near Asshai, they seemingly are also living in much more of a harmony with these shadow demons that live on their borders than the people are in Westeros. You have shadow binders and lots more shadow magic going on. You have the stories that there are no children in Asshai. It seems like rather than chasing away this shadow magic off to the periphery, they've sort of embraced it. And rather than, fully just getting rid of it all, they're actually using it and embracing some form of it to change the way that they live. I wouldn't necessarily say improve the way that they live, but sort of improve their magical power at the cost of, things like having children, apparently. Much like how old Nan told stories that we had wildling women laying with the others during the long night to sire terrible half-human children, well, the comparable story is the Dothraki saying Magi lay with the demons in Asshai, but they say that they do that in the modern day. So it seems like some of this sort of long night stuff is just still going on over near the Shadow in Asshai. And when you look at this as a localized thing, that makes actually quite a bit of sense. Also, potentially worth noting that of the three different places that we've sort of focused on here that seemingly were dealing with their own legendary monsters and their own sort of long night situation, well, Asshai is the one where it doesn't seem like they have a giant defensive structure built. It seems like, as I said, they are, rather than chasing it away and completely separating from this shadow magic, somehow sort of embracing it. It seems like rather than in Westeros, where just a few people like the Starks or these powerful old ways lords are the ones who have embraced this magic and are taking the power, Asshai is seemingly sort of just having like everyone embrace this, and there's a bunch of Shadowbinders, and everyone's learning magic, and there are no children, and all sorts of weird, crazy things are going on. It seems almost just like they took a completely different sort of solution to this problem that's led to completely different results, and maybe that is what George is trying to show us here. Two different ways that these magical powers can be corrupted and different effects that they could have on a society in the long run. This would also kind of make a lot of sense on the fact that if the corruption event that took place in the Far East over near the Shadow and Asshai was the creation of the dragons, well, people lived with dragons for thousands of years, and there was entire empires of dragon lords and things like that. So yeah, it seems like perhaps the shadow magic that was done way over in the Far East was far more embraced for far longer than what was done with the others over in Westeros. Or at the very least, they're much more on the surface with their connection to these shadow monsters than what goes on in Westeros, because the Dragon Lords are very in your face about it, and maybe the old Kings of Winter were that way, but if the others are on some level or another maintaining the Starks' power to this day, well, even the Starks themselves have forgotten about it. I suppose when you really look around the world and you see that the shrieking monsters still exist outside the five forts and the others are still causing problems in Westeros, and over in Asshai they are seemingly living with this shadow magic, it really seems like nowhere in the world has actually found a permanent solution to this problem. They're all having to live with this in one form or another. I'm not sure if by the end of the story we're going to have a permanent solution, or if we're just going to get another solution that's able to sort of kick this can down the road for several thousand more years. Because that is potentially a message that George could be sending, right? There are certain sort of fights, like the fight for freedom, that is sort of a thing that every generation is going to have to pick up. There's never going to be a permanent solution to some of these issues when they're issues that just derive from the nature of power as it exists in the world. When you take a look at the nature of this situation and how it seems like trying to take and use this shadow magic power to maintain your life or maintain your dynasty's power just leads to these types of things in Westeros, this does seem like maybe this is one of those problems that can never be permanently dealt with. So we could see Bran sort of establish himself as an immortal weirwood king who can live for thousands and thousands of years and enforce his ways and make sure that everything is done good. But that might actually just be everything that was done by Bran the Builder. Bran might think that that's the solution, and then go back and look at the history and realize, oh, Bran the Builder already tried this, and over time, look what happened to his old ways. They became far corrupted. And Bran may have to learn that, yeah, maybe actually letting each generation pick up that fight is the correct way to do things, rather than having these old ways that govern everything. There are a lot of different ways that it could go, and especially once we're this far into the speculation, I could be completely wrong about certain things that I'm talking about here, but I do think a lot of this all lines up pretty well. And I do have some pretty interesting things I've been thinking about recently regarding The Last Hero, The Night's King, and Bran the Builder, and just everything that was sort of going on around the ancient Starks around this time. And so, what I'm going to do is save those for the next video, which I've been sort of working on alongside this one. It would be too big of a tangent to include in this one, but thank you all very much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe so that you don't miss that next video, and maybe share this video with someone else who would find it interesting. Thank you very much, and I'll be back with something else very soon.